The air was a biting blade, slicing through the threadbare layers that clung to Alara's skin. It carried the scent of coal dust and desperation, a smell she had come to associate with the gnawing hunger in her belly and the perpetual ache in her bones. Her daughter, Clara, a wisp of a child barely 7 years old, shivered beside her, her small hands raw and chapped from grubbing in the cold earth. The pit boss, a man whose face was a map of greed and indifference, barked orders, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. This place, this temporary hell masquerading as an opportunity, was bleeding them dry, soul and body. Every sunrise brought the same fear, not for herself, but for Clara. Watching the light fade in her eyes, the childish wonder replaced by a hollow weariness. Survival was a tightrope walk over an abyss, and she felt herself losing balance. Then, a stranger. He stood apart from the usual crowd of downtrodden workers and hard-faced overseers. Tall, broad-shouldered under a worn but sturdy coat, his hat low over his eyes, obscuring his expression. He wasn't from the mines. His clothes were too clean, his posture too steady. He watched them, not with the leering gaze of some men, nor the pity of others, but with an unreadable stillness. He spoke to the pit boss, a low murmur that Alara couldn't decipher over the rattle of carts and the hacking coughs around them. The boss gestured towards Alara and Clara, a dismissive flick of his wrist. A brief, sharp negotiation followed, coins changing hands. Alara's blood ran cold. What fresh torment was this? Had they been sold? To whom? For what purpose? The stranger approached. Up close, his face was weathered, lined around the eyes, set in a perpetual, almost grim neutrality. His eyes, when they met hers briefly, were the color of a stormy sky, gray and deep, giving nothing away. He wasn't young, nor old, somewhere in the hard middle of life. He simply extended a hand, not to touch, but as a silent summons. You, and the girl. Come. His voice was low, rough-edged, but held no immediate malice. Fear warred with a flicker of defiant suspicion in Alara's chest. Where would he take them? What would he demand? But the alternative was to remain, to watch Clara fade away in this dust-choked hell. The decision was not hers to make, not truly. They were property here. He had paid. She gathered Clara, pulling her close, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. Clara clung to her, a small, trembling bundle. Without another word, the stranger turned and walked towards the edge of the camp where a lone wagon waited, a sturdy horse hitched to it. Alara followed, her worn boots crunching on the frozen ground, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her more heavily than any sack of coal she'd ever carried. They climbed into the back of the wagon. It was bare save for a couple of rough blankets and a sack. He climbed into the driver's seat without looking back. The horse started forward, pulling them away from the noise, the smell, the despair that had been their world. Alara risked a glance back. The pit boss stood watching, a sneer on his face. The camp shrank, then vanished behind the rising ground. The silence that fell was broken only by the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon. Alara huddled with Clara under a thin blanket, watching the vast, empty land unfold before them, a land as desolate and unknown as their future. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked for hers. They were simply taken. The journey stretched over days, a blur of cold nights spent huddled by meager fires and long, silent hours bumping along rough trails under a sky that seemed impossibly wide and indifferent. Alara learned his name by overhearing him speak to the horse. Elias. He spoke little to them, offering only basic necessities. A crust of bread, a sip of water from a canteen, a shared pot of lukewarm beans over a fire. His movements were economical, deliberate. He seemed perpetually alert, his gaze scanning the horizon, the land, his surroundings. He didn't offer comfort, but he didn't inflict cruelty either. This absence of malice, after the casual brutality of the camp, was a strange, unsettling kindness. Alara watched him constantly, trying to decipher his purpose, his character. He was self-contained, a man used to solitude. He wasn't unkind to Clara, offering her a piece of jerky once. A silent gesture that made the child recoil shyly behind Alara's skirt before hunger won out. Clara, after the initial shock, began to watch Elias with a child's open curiosity, though she remained mostly silent. Alara held Clara close at night, listening to the wind, the distant calls of unseen creatures, the steady breathing of the man who now owned them. Owned. The word tasted like ash. But he hadn't treated them like property. He treated them like necessary cargo. A means to an end, perhaps. What end? A wife? A servant? The uncertainty was a dull throb behind her eyes. Her internal landscape remained a fortress of fear and suspicion, but a tiny crack had appeared, allowing a sliver of weary hope to enter. Hope that this life, whatever it was, might at least be survivable, perhaps even offer a chance for Clara to see a future beyond the dust. They arrived at the ranch late one afternoon, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks in the distance, bleeding color across the vast sky. It was less a ranch and more a collection of weathered structures clinging to the land, a small, sturdy cabin, a sagging barn, a corral holding a few scrawny cattle, a lonely horse besides the wagon horse. The place felt remote, isolated, miles from anywhere. The silence here was different from the camp. It was vast, encompassing, broken only by the wind and the lowing of the cattle. Elias didn't give them a grand tour. He led them into the cabin. It was small, Spartan, clean but clearly lived in by one person for a long time. A single cot, a rough table, a fireplace that held the remains of a recent fire. A kettle hung over it. "You'll sleep here," he said, indicating a corner near the fireplace where he'd spread a couple of thicker blankets. "There's water. We eat when I cook. There's work to be done." His gaze swept over them, assessing. "You can cook?" Alara nodded, her voice rusty. "Yes." "Good. There's flour, beans. Learn the land, the layout. Stay close for now. Wolves." Other things he didn't elaborate. He just pointed towards the rough-hewn door. "I'll be outside," and then he was gone, leaving them alone in the quiet cabin. Alara knelt by the fireplace, the residual warmth a welcome comfort. Clara pressed against her side. Alara looked around the small space, then out the single window at the desolate, beautiful landscape. This was their new cage, but it was cleaner, quieter, larger than the last. She hugged Clara tighter. Survival. That was the only command. And now, perhaps, the command extended to understanding this silent, enigmatic man and this lonely, demanding place. Weeks bled into months. The harsh grip of winter tightened its hold on the land. Alara and Clara settled into a routine dictated by Elias and the demands of the struggling ranch. Alara proved herself capable, surprisingly so. The instinct for survival sharpened her mind, her observation. She watched Elias, mirroring his tasks, anticipating needs before he voiced them. She learned to mend fences, care for the few cattle, ration supplies with grim efficiency. She learned to read the signs of the weather in the sky, to handle the cold that seemed to permeate everything. Elias said little, but his eyes missed nothing. A slight nod of approval when she finished a chore efficiently, a shared glance over a struggling calf. These were the only acknowledgments, but they were enough. Clara, initially withdrawn, began to bloom in the relative safety and stillness of the ranch. Her cough faded, her cheeks gained a little color. She still clung to Alara, but she also began to explore the small cabin, the yard. She watched Elias from a distance, sometimes drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick, crude figures that Alara recognized as themselves, and sometimes a tall, silent figure beside them. Alara taught Clara letters using charcoal on scraps of wood, whispering stories to keep the darkness at bay. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it had transformed into a quiet vigilance, a determination to make themselves indispensable, to earn their keep not just as bought labor, but as necessary parts of this fragile whole. Alara began to see glimpses of the man beneath the stoic exterior. He was fiercely private, his past a locked box. But she saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes after a long day, the gentleness in his rough hands as he tended to an injured animal, the way he would sometimes stand outside at night, looking up at the stars, a profound loneliness radiating from him. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the ways she understood cruelty. He was a solitary one, weathered and shaped by hardship, much like the landscape around them. A silent understanding began to grow between them, built not on words, but on shared work, shared silence, and the mutual reliance forced upon them by their isolation. They were three disparate souls bound together by a strange transaction and the unforgiving demands of the wilderness. Then, the threat arrived, not a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping danger. A neighboring rancher, a man named Cal, rode up one day, his face slick with false conviviality, his eyes lingering too long on Alara, then assessing Elias's meager herd. He spoke of drought further south, of scarce water and dwindling land, hinting darkly at those who couldn't hold on to what was theirs. He left a chill in the air long after his dust settled. Elias grew even more withdrawn, spending long hours riding the fence lines, his rifle always close. Alara overheard snippets of his worries. Debts, the struggle to find decent feed, the possibility of losing the ranch if the spring didn't bring rain. Losing the ranch meant losing their fragile haven. It meant being cast out again, perhaps back into a life even worse than the mines. The fear, once a personal dread, now encompassed the small world they had built together. It was no longer just about Alara and Clara's survival. It was about the survival of Elias's ranch, their quiet sanctuary, and the unspoken bond that had formed between them. The vulnerability she had arrived with transformed into a fierce, protective instinct for this land and the man who had, in his own silent way, given them refuge. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing squeeze. Weeks without significant rain turned the land brittle and dry. The grass was sparse, the creek dwindled to a trickle. The cattle grew thin, their lowing mournful. Cal returned, this time with two other men, their demeanor openly predatory. They rode onto Elias's land, claiming stray cattle, their eyes insolent. Elias met them at the edge of the corral, rifle in hand, his face hard stone. "Get off my land," Cal sneered, dismounting slowly. "Just checkin' on things, Elias. Heard you're having a tough time. Might be looking to expand my own spread." His gaze flicked towards the cabin, towards Alara standing in the doorway, Clara behind her skirt. "Heard you got some help too. Cost you much?" Alara felt a surge of cold fury. She was not livestock to be discussed. Elias's jaw tightened. "They're mine, not for sale. Now leave." The tension crackled. The air hung thick and heavy, smelling of dust and unspoken threats. Cal took a step forward, reaching for his sidearm. This wasn't just about land or cattle. It was about power, about breaking Elias, about claiming what he saw as rightfully available. Suddenly, Clara whimpered and pulled back into the cabin. Alara's eyes narrowed. This wasn't her fight, yet it was everything. Elias was outnumbered, but he stood his ground. In that instant, Alara didn't see the man who had bought her. She saw the man who had offered shelter, shared his meager food, stood silent watch while they slept. She saw the quiet strength that had allowed her and Clara to breathe again. Without conscious thought, driven by an instinct she hadn't known she possessed, Alara stepped fully into the doorway. She held a worn but heavy iron poker in her hand, gripping it tight. Her face, usually wary, was set in a mask of grim determination. She didn't speak, but her posture, her gaze fixed on Cal, spoke volumes. She was not a frightened commodity anymore. She was a defender. Cal's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then narrowed in annoyance. He hadn't expected resistance from the help. Elias spared a quick, assessing glance at Alara, a flicker of something unreadable in his stormy eyes. The unspoken communication passed between them, a shared front, a mutual defense. Elias took a small step, positioning himself slightly in front of the cabin door, shielding Alara and Clara, but not dismissing Alara's stand. The three men exchanged glances. This wasn't going to be the easy intimidation they expected. Facing a man with a rifle was one thing, but facing a united front, the unexpected fierceness in Alara's eyes shifted the dynamic. Cal hesitated. The risk suddenly seemed higher than the potential reward of a few scrawny cattle and harassing a lonely rancher. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand from his sidearm. "All right, Elias. We'll be going. For now." He backed away, his eyes still on Alara, a new, grudging respect perhaps mixed with resentment. His men followed, mounting their horses. They rode away, leaving silence in their wake, a silence charged with the aftermath of confrontation. Elias lowered his rifle. He looked at Alara for a long moment, his gaze intense. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, a slow, meaningful inclination of his head. Alara lowered the poker, her knuckles white. The fear receded, replaced by a trembling exhaustion, but also an exhilarating sense of having stood her ground, of having been part of something larger than herself. In the quiet that followed, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the dry land, Alara didn't retreat into the cabin. She walked slowly towards Elias, stopping a few feet away. Clara, sensing the shift, crept to the doorway, watching. Alara looked out at the land, at the weary cattle, at the setting sun. "It needs rain," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Elias looked at the sky. It was not a conversation about weather. It was about survival, about the future. He looked at her again, really looked at her, perhaps seeing not the woman he had bought from hardship, but the resilient, fierce individual who had stood by him. The transaction felt a million miles away. They were no longer owner and bought. They were two people with a child, bound by the harsh realities of the land and a moment of shared defiance. Alara's journey from a commodity of labor, bought like goods, to a woman standing shoulder to shoulder against a threat, was complete. The vulnerability had not disappeared, but it was tempered by a strength forged in necessity and quiet dignity. Elias didn't offer grand pronouncements. He didn't need to. His actions, his silent acceptance of her as a partner in this struggle, spoke louder than any words. The ranch was still struggling. The rain hadn't come. Threats still lurked on the horizon. But as Alara watched him walk towards the barn, his shoulders perhaps a little less burdened than before, she knew they would face it together. This lonely place, bought with coin and grit, had become a haven not because of the transaction that brought them here, but because of the humanity they had found and built within its desolate confines. Resilience wasn't just enduring. It was about finding connection, about standing tall not just for yourself, but for the fragile world you had come to protect. The three of them, bound by circumstance, now faced the future not as owner and owned, but as a quiet, steadfast partnership against the unforgiving world. And in that partnership, there was a deep, quiet hope, as vast and enduring as the land itself.